Hey guys, I hope you guys had a great Thanksgiving, had a good break. We're a couple days in back to being to school. I'm really proud of all the hard work you guys are putting in. On Monday, we reviewed eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells with the quizzes, which is what we were talking about right before we went on break. And then yesterday, y'all read section 7.2, which covers the plasma membrane. So today, I want to cover 7.2 notes. So with the plasma membrane, the main idea is that the plasma membrane helps to maintain a cell's homeostasis. So remember, both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells have a plasma membrane. That is one of their similarities. And it's important, we talked early on about homeostasis, and that is staying the same. That's keeping a balance throughout. And remember, when we first talked about homeostasis, we said that if homeostasis cannot be maintained, then death can occur. So the plasma membrane is super important because it helps maintain a cell's homeostasis. So the function of the plasma membrane, it is a thin, flexible boundary between a cell and its environment that allows nutrients into the cell and allows waste and other products to leave the cell. So it kind of has the idea of a fishnet. So let's define homeostasis. Homeostasis is the process of maintaining balance in an organism's internal environment. So you'll hear the term selective permeability a lot when we talk about the plasma membrane. And it's exactly how it sounds. It is selective in what it allows to pass through. So it allows some substances to pass through while keeping others out. So it really is like a fishnet. When you catch something in the net, it's big enough to allow the fish in a certain area. But then once that area has been closed off or has been raised above the water, the holes that are left in the net are big enough to allow water in so the fish don't die, but they're small enough that the fish can't get out. So a net is a selective permeability, and that's exactly how a plasma membrane is. So this is a picture. This is the outside of the cell. This is the inside of the cell. And this brown line is the plasma membrane. So you can see here that it allows oxygen to come in and it allows water to come in, allows glucose to come in, but then it excretes, it gets rid of water, wastes, carbon dioxide. And then here, waste, it doesn't allow more waste to come in. So it's really important that you understand the structure of the plasma membrane. It's why and how the plasma membrane functions like it does. So phospholipid bilayer is something that you're going to hear a lot of, and that just means that it's two layers. Bi means two. So the phospholipid bilayer is two layers of phospholipids and they're arranged tail to tail. So a phospholipid is a molecule with a glycerol backbone, two fatty acid chains, and a phosphate-containing group. So here's that polar head, and then here are these two fatty acid tails, and that makes up a phospholipid. And you will hear a lot when I ask you the structure of a plasma membrane, you need to know that it's phospholipid bilayer. So here's a picture, just kind of an overall general picture. And we have a plasma membrane here, okay? We're going to talk about each of these things, but you need to see here that that is a phospholipid. Now, it's called a phospholipid bilayer because they line up tail to tail. This is a phospholipid and this is a phospholipid. So you have the blue represents the polar head and the two tails, those fatty acid chains, that makes up the nonpolar tail. So we're going to break that down a little more. So it has a polar head and a nonpolar tail. So the polar head lines up with the nonpolar tail. Something that is hydrophilic, it likes water. So a polar head is hydrophilic, meaning it likes water. The nonpolar tail is hydrophobic, and it doesn't like water. So if you have a phobia of something, you hate it, you're afraid of it, right? So nonpolar tail is hydrophobic. So hydro means water, phobic means fear of. So that tells you that it does not like water. The polar head is hydrophilic when you like something that's aphilic, when you love, like Philadelphia, brotherly love, city of love. So philic means love, hydro, water. So the polar head likes the water. Well, the fact that the polar tail does not like water, that's what forms the true barrier. So phospholipid, we have the polar head, the nonpolar tail. The phospholipid bilayer is made up of two phospholipids. So we have the polar heads and the polar tails here, or the nonpolar tails. The nonpolar tails are what line up together. So here's that picture again to show you, now that you understand it a little bit more. We have the polar head. Remember, polar head loves water. Nonpolar tail hates water. The fact that all of these are the tails, they hate water, they provide that true barrier. It's going to keep water out because it hates water. So it lines up tail to tail, right? So this is what makes up the phospholipid bilayer, because it's 1, 2 phospholipids. So there are 3 macromolecules found in the cell membrane. We have proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. Remember, we talked about the different types of macromolecules in the last chapter. There are 3 that are found in the cell membrane. So we're going to talk a little bit more about each of those. Okay, so there are 3 types of proteins found in the cell membrane. There's a transport protein, a receptor protein, and a membrane protein. The transport protein is the passageway for food. It's exactly what it sounds like. It moves substances and wastes. So transport, think if you are a transporter, you move things. So the transport protein acts as a passageway for food, for things to move across, and it moves substances and waste. Receptor proteins are what transmit signals to the inside of the cell. So typically the receptor protein is found on the top layer of a cell membrane, on the surface of a cell membrane, and it transmits signals coming from the outside or coming from other cells, and it transmits it in to the cell. So think like with your cell phone, you have to have reception, right, to send your text message or to make a phone call. And so the receptor protein acts as something that transmits the signal to the inside of the cell. It's the form of the communication. It's also shape specific, meaning that's what helps the cell take its shape. The membrane protein helps identify the cell. So it also picks up on signals, but it identifies the cell. But the big thing that you need to recognize with membrane proteins is it has a carbohydrate chain. So here's a picture that's kind of breaking down. So once again, let's recognize, here's our phospholipid bilayer. Here's the polar head and the nonpolar tails. And here are 3 types of proteins. We have the transport protein. Remember, it says we know that it's a channel that allows things to be moved. So this kind of looks like a tunnel, right? So that's the transport protein. You have the receptor protein. That is what transfers signals to the inside of the cell. So here it is. It's seen on the surface of the cell, and that's the receptor protein. The membrane protein will stick out. It goes down into the cell and into the cell membrane, but it sticks out on the surface. And here's what differentiates this from maybe the receptor protein, is that here's that carbohydrate chain coming off of it. So here's another little drawing. So here's the transport. Notice here, what is this? This is our phospholipid bilayer. We have one phospholipid, two phospholipid, polar head, nonpolar tail. So here we have, this is acting as a cell membrane. These represents the three types of proteins that are found in the cell membrane. We have the transport protein. See how it looks like a tunnel? Then we have the receptor protein, and then we have the membrane protein. Now notice this is hand drawn, so I'm not a Picasso. But if you see here, it looks kind of wiry, but if you're looking at something from the top, if we're identifying these types of proteins from the top of the cell membrane, 9 times out of 10, we're not going to be able to cut the membrane in half and look to see what kind it is. So we're going to have to recognize it from the surface of the transport, or from the surface of the cell membrane. And so this one we'll be able to see because it has the opening of a tunnel. This one has a little indentation, but we can see that it's not all the way down. But then this, it looks a little wiry at the top, but it also has this carbohydrate chain coming off the top. So the membrane protein, the dead giveaway for that is going to be that it has a carbohydrate chain coming off. So once again, here is the picture of the cell membrane. Now we've recognized the phospholipid bilayer, the two phospholipids here with the polar head and the nonpolar tail. But now we can recognize some more. So look here, we have this transport protein. Okay, there it is. Looks like a tunnel. And here we have a carbohydrate chain. So we know we can't see the top of the membrane protein here, but we know that this is a membrane protein because it has the carbohydrate chain coming off of it. So we talked about proteins being one of the three macromolecules found in a cell membrane. The second one is lipids, and you'll hear it referred to as cholesterol. And even in the picture that we have of our plasma membrane, it's labeled as cholesterol. So lipids help prevent the fatty acid tails of the phospholipid bilayer from sticking together. So remember, here's what we need to bring it back to. We have to fully understand the structure. In this picture, here's our bilayer. We have the polar heads and the nonpolar tail. Now remember, the nonpolar tail is made up of fatty acids, okay? This cholesterol, the lipids that are found within the cell membrane, keep those fatty acids from sticking together. So when you think about it, if you've ever seen like a chunk of fat that has been taken out or has been used as an example, it all sticks together, right? And that's why, like when we experience weight gain or something like that, it's fat coming together and sticking together. Well, if it weren't for the cholesterol found within the plasma membrane, then we would have the issue of these fatty acids sticking together. So that prevents that from happening. That contributes to the fluidity of the plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane can move, it can change shape, and cholesterol is another reason for that. Because if those fatty acids stuck together, it would just form this clump, this big shape. And by having the cholesterol, we keep those fatty acids from sticking together, allowing the fluidity to happen. So cholesterol is an important substance for maintaining homeostasis in a cell. And a little bit of cholesterol is good for your diet. You know, a lot of people have to go on a low cholesterol diet because they have high cholesterol. And we definitely don't want to take in too much cholesterol, but it's important to have a healthy intake and a healthy balance of cholesterol because it does play such a crucial role in our bodies. So carbohydrates. This is another one that people tend to say, okay, you need to be careful with how much carbs you eat, which is so true. But they're also something that's important within your body as well. So carbohydrates are attached to the membrane protein. Remember, that's the identifier for a membrane protein is that carbohydrate chain. And they stick out from the plasma membrane to define cells' characteristics and help cells identify chemical signals. So remember, one of the functions of a membrane protein was to identify cells, and that's where that carbohydrate chain comes in. It's on the outside. It sticks out of the plasma membrane, and it defines that cell's characteristics, but it also helps the cell identify chemical signals coming from other cells. So, as much as you need to know and you need to understand the phospholipid bilayer, you also need to know that the cell membrane is known as the fluid mosaic model. Now remember, we said cholesterol is important because it helps a cell membrane maintain fluidity. Fluidity is so important because the cell membrane is known as the fluid mosaic model. Essentially, what it means, if any of y'all are artsy or you're familiar with art, you know that a mosaic is just a combination of all these patterns and all of these what would seem like odd and end pieces, but come together and make such a beautiful picture. Well, the same is true with the cell membrane. There is a ton of proteins and they're suspended in liquid. So we talked about the three types of proteins, right? We said there's a membrane protein, there's a receptor protein, and there's a transport protein. So you have these three proteins and they're suspended in a liquid. They're suspended in a fluid. So together they make up this fluid mosaic model. So on the left here, you have a mosaic in art, but then on the right, you have a cell membrane, which is obviously different, but similar in the sense that it's these random things that come together, but these random things that may not make up much on their own together are crucial and make up a big image that is capable of doing so much. So once again, here's a picture of a fluid mosaic model of a plasma membrane. And here we have all of these parts, right? It's suspended. We have the cholesterol, we have the polar head and the nonpolar tail making up that phospholipid bilayer. We have these carbohydrate chains, we have these proteins. We have all of these things suspended in a liquid, in a fluid mosaic model.